All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Peter Lipsett, Vice President at DonorsTrust and host of the Giving Ventures podcast. It's podcast to podcast experience here today. Longtime listeners will remember that he was previously our guest in episode 74. That was last May. So let me say welcome back to Free the Economy, Peter.
So glad to be back. Thanks, Richard.
So, for people who might have missed your previous appearance, uh, let's start. Give us a quick summary of what Donors Trust does, and then we'll get into the series that you've been working on.
Sure. So Donors Trust is the conservative movement's uh, leading donor advised fund focused on conservative, libertarian, faith-based donors, helping them to simplify, protect, grow their giving. So think of us like a community foundation that you may be familiar with, or if folks use Fidelity or Schwab or Vanguard for their donor advised fund needs, we're that, but with the mission focus around the types of things that CEI donors and CEI folks who engage with CEI would actually care about. Limited government, personal responsibility, free enterprise. And we've been at it for 25 years and $2.5 billion put out into the philanthropic ecosystem in that time.
All right, wow. Gosh, if I had received just 10% of that, I'd be doing really well. Um, so so this summer you've been producing, I think, a pretty fascinating series from that podcast, Giving Ventures, about political ideas and political ideologies. So called "What is Right?"
What
Excellent.
is the right? Very
What
specifically,
what
the right.
what is the right? Um,
What is right is a very metaphysical podcast that I am in no way, shape, or form ready to do.
all these people on the right are also debating what is the right thing to do, though. Um, so, so this has featured some great interviews, including a couple of people Free the Economy listeners will recognize, like our guest from episode 17, Stephanie Slade, and our episode 37 guest, Ovik Roy. So, uh, it's a bunch of different people kind of debating different angles on the like kind of right side of the political spectrum. How did you come up with this idea?
It came from trying to, as most good ideas, trying to scratch that personal itch, right? Of looking around. I would certainly probably classify myself in the same way that I imagine a lot of people at CEI, many people listening to this probably would, in more of that libertarian, conservative, conservatarian type person, freedom conservative, as we get into the episodes and classify it that way, almost an old line kind of Reaganite approach, but realizing over the past really the past decade, there's been a lot of change, a lot of froth in what it means to be quote unquote on the right. And realizing in particular that what I didn't understand was national conservatism, the new right, what were the real ideologies there, the depth of that, and then how were all these different things changing. We did an episode on the traditionalists. I wouldn't have even specified that as a thing. I'm not a student of these different rabbit holes of thought, more so just kind of a inch deep and a mile wide type guy. And so it's been really interesting to try to understand them more and where their place is, not just in the 100-year history of the right, but today in this really unique, kind of weird time that we have where we're talking to each other in a slightly different way.
Yeah, and so I'm looking at this episode list and for the series, and I see it seems like there's a lot of ways you could have sliced this up and a lot of different labels. Um, but the ones we have in front of us are the free cons, freedom conservatives, libertarians, the new right, traditionalist conservatives, fusionists. That's where our friend Stephanie Slade came in. Catholics on the right, Jewish conservatives, and conservative Christianity. So did you did you start out by tailoring these to sort of like the ideological distribution of donors trust clients and people you work with, or did you just look at the like modern politics left to right spectrum and picked what you thought were like the largest identifiable groups?
Mostly trying to figure out what are the major lines of thought that are influencing what it means to be the right these days. Because you can't just say, oh, the right is this monolithic thing. It's not anymore. There are these different strands. And some are, frankly, more pro-government, certainly more willing to have state intervention. Some are less so, but understand the value of power. Some eschew power and don't think that we should really have any interference from government at all, if we should have it at all. Some are more focused on thinking, like the traditionalists. Some are more focused on doing, like the new right. And the new right one, we can get into this, was probably the hardest one for me, both because that's not a background that I'm really of, but also I just had to learn how to use that vocabulary and the difference between new right and national conservatism and even other factions within there. Who are the right players? As with any newer movement, it still has a lot of things that it is sorting out. So that's been really interesting. And then I wanted to make sure we looked at the religious side too, because faith is such an important part of the right. And it's not, I mean, many of us, I think Richard, you and I both grew up in when, in the mid 90s when the Christian coalition was a huge deal for
Mhm.
political power and the rise of the right then. That faded, but other things came along. Obviously, the Jewish impact is very important right now. Catholics are having a moment right now. And so it's really important to try to understand all of these different pieces because they've got to talk to each other if we're going to have some kind of coherent movement.
Well, yeah, and I think that with like that list that we just went down there, like I said, there's probably, different ways. A different, slightly different observer might have come up with like one extra or one fewer of those groups potentially, depending on how thin we want to slice the coalitional cake. But I wonder, in the conversations you've had, how much overlap is there between these groups? And are there some places where there's more of a sort of a Venn diagram overlap than others? Because I can imagine that the libertarians and the new right might be the most unlike each other and be more likely to be antagonistic, but say traditionalists as a category and Catholics as a category would have a lot in common.
Yeah, you're right. And the Venn diagram there's a lot of overlapping bits. As you say, some of them almost don't overlap at all. The libertarian episode actually started with Peter Gettler pushing back on the whole premise of the conversation that being a libertarian is on the right at all.
Right.
Because our great libertarian friends like to kind of push away the left-right diatribe as it is, and that's fair. I totally understand that argument, but they're kind of stuck with being on the right, for better or for worse. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that the whole circle was colored in, even if there was too much ink in one spot, right? And so you're
Mhm.
right. Freedom conservatives, libertarians, even certain parts of the Christian and the Jewish parts, all of them, they overlap a lot. The new right is the biggest outlier. And then the faith ones bring in their own little outlier parts because obviously they are in theory, less focused on the political, more focused on faith and life. And I think Chris Morin in particular gave a really good pushback of that, of, the Catholics generally see themselves as Catholic first instead of leading on the political side. And yeah, I can go down that rabbit hole further, but I want to make sure everything was covered, knowing that some of it was going to get covered multiple times.
Well, yeah, and I mean, there's also a certain irony here where in which even some of the traditionalists or religious conservatives have actually their position in American politics and public life has changed. Where many people who've written about modern American politics have said, look, evangelical Christians in a lot of the 20th century were either Democratic voters or largely apolitical or intentionally shunned engaging in partisan politics, right? Because they thought it was a sort of corrupt thing that was of this world, not of the heavenly kingdom. But whereas starting in the 1970s, and certainly well into the 1990s, evangelicals were sort of shorthand for any religious conservative that was Republican, right? They sort of became the heart of the conservative activist movement, and so the it's I sort of think about that. What does that mean to say that for people who are from that perspective, they would say, well, we believe in eternal truths, right? We believe in tradition, but their position in politics has changed dramatically over the past 50 years. Do you get into that?
Well, I think so. The Christian conservative episode actually, I think, shows the fundamental kind of discordance, disagreement, question that the whole of the right is experiencing right now. And I thought it was a great episode because we had Ralph Reed used to lead the Christian Coalition, now is leading another faith and family coalition. And then we had Mark Tooley, who has a Methodist background, a more mainline denomination background, and he really speaks to from his perch at Religion and Democracy, Institute on Religion and Democracy, of a culture first approach. That yes, we want these ends, frankly, from a political side, we want limited government and all of that. But we believe we can get there by filling the pews, bringing people back to Christ, strengthening the church, lead with culture, and the political values we care about will come from it. Versus a more Ralph Reed approach with Faith Family Coalition and others is kind of saying, "Hey, we have these values. Let's go show them at the ballot box because we are, ostensibly already living them out every day." And to me, that's the fundamental thing I've learned throughout the series is the debate going on is we have this power, we being the right. So we'll kind of stipulate that at least we're on that team together. We as the right have this power moment right now. How are we going to use it? And there are voices like the freedom conservatives that are saying we need to take advantage, but we want to be cautious. We still have these principles, versus more on the new right side where they say we've got power and we're going to get it done. We don't need consensus. We don't need buy-in. We don't need to bring the middle with us. Now's our chance. Let's get it done. I think freedom conservatives, libertarians, even some of the traditionalists, so that that's a divide, want to bring the middle along, and the fusionists certainly. And I think that's to me the fundamental question. How are we going to use this power?
Hmm. Well, yeah, I think there's a this question of some of these overlapping groups when some of them overlap more than others. Uh, Kind of makes me think about the conflict uh, between sort of means and ends, right? So is your ideology about what you want to accomplish or more about how it should or shouldn't be accomplished? So, you know, I think you could say you could be a religious traditionalist and think the best route to doing that is libertarian public policy. Right. You could say, well, I would like my children to learn religious values. And so I want to advocate for school choice so everyone can send their kid to whatever school they want. uh, I want sort of like the libertarian version of school choice policy, because I don't want to empower the government-run schools because I think they'll probably end up, pushing values I don't agree with. So you could be both, right? Right. You could be someone who believes in like libertarian politics, which is a small government, um, and you could be a left winger who believes that, or you could be a very conservative person who believes that. Uh, but the libertarian view is about how things get done and how much power government should have, not necessarily how religiously conservative you are. And so uh, there's there's more than just some of these ideologies overlap. There's some of them are defined really by values and goals, and I think some of them are defined more by kind of process and political theory, if that makes sense.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you're certainly your libertarians have a worldview. They're going to stick to that worldview. Politics is just an expedient, but mostly they're staying out of it. Traditionalists are the same way. Very different values than a lot of libertarians in a lot of ways. The traditionalists are more, looking at that Judeo-Christian heritage. How do we keep that alive? But wary when it comes to politics. But the values align a little bit more with the new right national conservative crowd in a lot of different ways. The Catholic integralist crowd, a phrase I had no idea what that really meant until I launched into this series. So I think you're right. I think there is, it's the classic 4x4 matrix of like how much power and how much ideology are you going to really be pushing?
Well, yeah, and I know the traditionalist conversation I thought was very interesting because um, w in terms of sort of American political history, because if you ask a lot of American conservatives or anyone who's even vaguely on the right, they'll say, well, America is all about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the constitutional order and how we created our system of government at the end of the 18th century. And some of the traditionalists would say, some of your guests said, uh, oh, well, no, no, no. With our view goes back hundreds and hundreds of years before that, and you have to understand to if you want to say that's what America's about, you have to understand well all of the centuries of history that influenced our founding fathers and um, colonial history, and what people understandably look at what happened during the Constitutional Congress and the debates that were happening, like the Federalist Papers. But they said you have to look at like town meetings that were happening in Massachusetts and Connecticut in the 1640s, right? That's at least, if not much farther back beyond that. Um, and so one, there's a sort of like a lot of pre-American founding philosophical tradition. I think those guys really emphasize, but also the idea that there's a certain implication, right, that the older the traditions are, the more valid they are, the more useful they are, and that previous ways of doing things are probably all of the things being equal, you should probably kind of assume the older ways are the better. Uh, but even in that discussion, they were sort of saying that and there's some people who are which you might almost call like primitivist conservatives or primitivist tradition, conservatives, traditionalists, who say, well, actually, it would be better if we just all lived on small farms, right? Um, and renounced voluntarily or not, up for debate, but that we'd have a better society if we all lived on in small towns and had our farms and had our parish churches, and that was sort of it. Um, and I couldn't help but thinking that that was sort of presented as if that were sort of like a extreme slash utopian view of things. But of course, even that exists in the modern world. We have Amish communities all around us, right? In a bunch of different states where there's Amish and Mennonite communities. I've been to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I've seen them with their horse and buggies. Um, and that I thought was sort of interesting, sort of popped in my head. I didn't hear either of those guests on that episode mention the Amish specifically, but it emphasized to me how much diversity there is in this country in the 21st century, and how in a largely open society you can have all of those things, right? You can have techno utopians in Silicon Valley who feel like they're living in the 24th century, right? Or they like us to believe they are. Um, but you still have small town farms in Amish country, and no one's those two groups certainly don't seem to be at each other's throats.
Well, this starts to get at one of the bees that get in my bonnet of just the nationalization of everything, like capital E everything. It's nationalized now. And one of the things I liked about the traditionalist episode was the fact that, they talked about ideally you stay out of politics and have these ideas, and they are the ultimate Chesterton fence type people, right? Let's just keep with what we got. And if we're going to knock it down, let's ask a lot of questions first. But Dan Sullivan on that episode made the point of if you're going to do politics, go as local as you can. To your point, know your neighbors, know your family, know how that some change in your community affects the other people in your community. Try to live in harmony with them, and I think that's important. I mean, I live in a small town in Western Virginia. The county has 30,000 people in it, but our local newspaper, the op-ed page, every week is, maybe 8 letters, and 7 of them are complaining about national issues. And, what's the impact there versus the fact that the storefronts downtown keep moving around, and there's a college trying to take over all of down. Like there are real substantive issues to talk about locally, but let's complain about Trump or Biden or the local congressman or anything. And so I hear you, and I think the more we nationalize all of these discussions, it becomes harder and harder for these different factions to actually have a cohesive understanding of each other, even because everything hinges on the argument of the day versus, well, this is the thing that I care about. That's the thing you care about. Let's find a way to compromise on these and get there. But everything is hot takes and speed.
Yeah, the idea that everyone of any political persuasion or group, the idea that we're all need to be locked in a like forever war with each other over who gets to win every national policy issue, um, seems like a way to burn up a lot of, you know, otherwise enjoyable life hours on a war that's never going to be won. Because if you say, imagine you have a small town, like you can have a uh, a voluntary commune of left wingers who hold all their property in common and uh, grow organic tofu. But across the street, you could also have a traditionalist Catholic community full of people in vocations, right? And nothing would stop you, right, from both of those things existing in harmony, except it seems to me the desire of every other group to say, oh, there's only one best way to do this, and so you know the hippies have to like let people fly Trump flags, and then the Catholic traditionalists have to like, pay for birth control, and we're just going to like fight over that for the next 30 years through Congress and the courts. Whereas it seems like it would be possible, should be possible, just to let each of these groups do their own thing, um, without making everything a battle to the death.
And you need the groups talking to each other. And frankly, I think that's where we part of the fracturing that we're seeing is because I think there were some folks left behind, rightfully. Again, I have a lot of frustrations and questions about the new right and some of the ways they approach things, some of the things that they prioritize. But, they are raising some issues that particularly kind of the fusionist right has kind of neglected. I would make the argument, as much as I would probably call myself a fusionist uh, in and of itself, I think over time, the liberty side of fusionism, if fusionism is liberty and values kind of coming together, the liberty side is kind of won out. And the value side, the more traditionalists, kind of faith-driven side of the fusionist argument has had that voice pushed down a little bit. And I think that leads to some of the populism you have today because some of those are the voices that, are in small town Ohio where the steel forge left 20 years ago and no other company is coming in, right? And those are the grievances that the new right is talking about because nobody was talking to those people. Nobody was tending to their needs. They said, well, free market, and we believe this, and it's true. Free markets are going to lift everybody up, but it's not going to lift everybody up evenly. And politicians don't necessarily have the bravery to admit to that and say, and we need to figure out solutions so that we can help those getting left behind. Because eventually the system will change and they're not going to get left behind anymore. Somebody else is going to get left behind. It's a dynamic system. I think everyone on the right can agree that the victimization narrative of the left that kind of looks at monocausal, static, once you're a victim, always a victim, is not the way it is. But what the new right, I think, rightly says is there can be victims on our side. They might change. And right now, we need to understand who those are.
Well, yeah, and all of these, perspectives is sort of presented as being varieties of the right side of the left-right political spectrum. Like you said, I guess like, Peter Gettler, the Cato Institute sort of pushed back on whether libertarians, for example, should be considered on the right or not. But, if we do accept this premise, right, that the different groups we're talking about are all sort of generally broadly on the right side of the political spectrum, have you have you found to be sort of analogs to these groups on the left? Are there like left-wing versions of all of these on the right ideologies? Because if you take Catholics on the right, for example, um, certainly presupposes the existence of Catholics on the left, right? There's liberation theology. There's plenty of left-wing Catholics. Plenty of people I know would say Pope Francis, the dearly departed His Holiness, who died earlier this year, would have fit as being on economic issues the Catholic of the left. Um, to what extent do these categories that you've been sort of examining and having these conversations about, do they map onto left-wing versions? Do some of them do and some of them don't? How does that work?
I think they do. And I'm not a student of this, so this is an imperfect answer. On the faith side, I think it's easy, right? All three Catholics, the Christian one, the Jewish one, all were very clear about there being people on the other side. I'm a mainline Presbyterian. I'm a minority as a conservative in the mainline Presbyterian church, right? Um, so the faith, that's a given. You're right. And those are kind of slightly different conversations. On the analogs to the others, maybe the kind of abundance Democrat would kind of map closer to the freedom conservatives and trying to find a not quite a middle way, but and maybe the fusionists too. I'd say the loud progressives are a little bit more like the new right and the analog there, and that's why you have so many people starting to talk about horseshoe theory because some of the tactics start almost look like they're beginning to touch when you get to the new right and the progressives. And on the traditionalists, I don't know what the analog is there. Maybe it's the communists, the people who believe in an old line ideology that hasn't quite been tried.
Yeah, and I was talking to Emma Camp of Reason Magazine, and we talked about this. It's been sort of a cliche now on social media where people who are sort of like these utopian left wingers will say, "What will your job be on the communist commune after we have a revolution and abolish communism?" And everyone gets to live on a fun left wing commune. What will your job be? And then everyone comes up with their, I'll be making lattes, or I'll be giving seminars on critical theory. Um, uh, I'm sure on the like traditionalists they will say like I'll be hand making crucifixes and doing stuff like that. Um, when it comes to what the right means in political philosophy, and this is a question I've thought about a lot. It comes up in all these questions about ideology, and this is relevant to the questions of whether like libertarians belong on the right or not, for example. One definition I've heard that kind of struck in my brain is that people on the right believe that human nature has no history, which is interesting, sort of gnomic kind of phrase, but just the idea that human beings, we have the same flaws and same sinful impulses at every time in history over the centuries, and that human beings as human beings aren't really perfectible by human created institutions. Uh, there's there's no such thing as like the new socialist man, for example. Like human nature isn't fundamentally changed just because we create some new um, uh, political structures. Um, what do you think about that as a difference between, because like we said, there's so much heterogeneity on, one half or the other half of the political spectrum. There's a lot of disagreement, but as a way of saying who's probably more on the right and probably who's more on the left of that as kind of like a master key that, human nature is eternal, it doesn't really change, and we can't make human beings better in any meaningful way by implementing some new political program.
I mean, you come born with a certain set of hardware, right? And we're all preloaded with that. And Jonah Goldberg at the beginning of Suicide of the West talks about the miracle and the kind of Western capitalism that grew out of the Netherlands and went into England and ultimately jumped the pond and came here with more Enlightenment ideas, et cetera, and created this great country we have today. But makes the point that's the opposite of what the nature of man really is. You strip all that away. If an EMP takes us out tomorrow, it takes out the grid, and we're all just functioning if your communist role was going to be to make the lattes, there's no lattes to make, there's no electricity to make it. You got to figure out something. And then you get to revert to cold, hard power. And so I think to me, the fundamental difference between the left and the right is the right, broadly speaking, swims upstream toward those Madisonian ideas of man is not perfect. And so we must create the institutions, create guardrails that will actually allow us to be as perfectible as possible, to give some rules of the game that make it possible for us to live in civilized society versus just letting the river take us, which just takes us back to power, brute force, strongman ideology that I think the left gives into and its impulses a little bit too much. And to me, that's a big fundamental difference. I mean, I already talked about the power dynamics on the right and how I think the how we use power is the big question. But I think that gulf is even bigger when it comes to the right and the left, or at least I hope it would be. I think it that the size of that gap is narrowing a little bit.
And I'm interested how, I mean, these are all fascinating conversations for but definitely for political theory nerd like myself to listen to. I like nothing better than a conversation of three people talking about political ideas for at least an hour. Um, but I'm also interested in how it kind of fits into to your job and Donors Trust's mission, which is, in part to sort of match people with money who want to make donations to good causes, and say, here's a good cause, right? Because if you're someone and you've got, more than a few dollars to give away, uh, but your career is in, widget manufacturing, you don't necessarily know about all the like the world of nonprofits and which ones are good ones, which ones have good track records, which ones are good at getting things done. So it makes perfect sense that uh, groups like Dota Trust exist to kind of give that advice. And 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 this seems to me like it would be an important part of that process. Like if you sit down with someone and you're like, well, I just sold my company and I'm ready to give away $1 million a year for the next 20 years. Where where do I give it to? You might very well start by asking them questions about like, well, what kind of conservative are you?
I think that's right. I think it accrues to our benefit because, unlike even some other donor advised funds on the right, we very much view ourselves at Donors Trust as a big picture, big tent organization. We give to hardcore libertarian organizations. We give to great evangelical organizations. We give to kind of more free con organizations, and everything in between, and even to the new right type organizations. So we want to cover it all for those people who kind of believe broadly, limited government, personal responsibility, free enterprise. And you're right. I think that conversation with a new donor does need to try to suss out where do they fall in this, because that's going to tell us a lot about the types of groups that they want to support. If they come in guns blazing and saying, I think, you know, Turning Point USA and American Compass are really changing the game and doing great work, okay, I'm probably not going to recommend CEI necessarily to that donor versus somebody who says, I worry about regulation. I think that we're trying too hard to, you know, uh, meet a populist moment. Okay, well then suddenly a CEI or an AEI or some of these types of groups have become much more appealing. So I think that's part of our job is to understand that. I think that's why this series is important, why I wanted to embark on it. I am not a political philosophy nerd. But I swim in these waters and I knew that was a gap in my own thinking. I wanted to understand it better. But one thing that I've thought a lot about in terms of, okay, what do the donors care about though? I mean, this is interesting. It's fun to look at all these different things. How much are they actually thinking about it? And in talking to them and my assessment of what they tell me, they're not thinking about these different columns of groups, factions, flavors of the right nearly as much as those of us who work in it
Mm.
are. They just want to win. And particularly after, 8 years of Obama, these past 4 years of Biden, the institutions feeling against them, the rise of wokeness, there are a lot of donors who put themselves on the right who just feel their back is against the wall, that they're losing all the time, and they want to win. Trump certainly tapped into something in his first go round where he said, you're going to be tired of winning. Like we don't win enough, and that's true. Like that is the donor sentiment. That is the crux of it. And so some of us who may be frustrated at the rise of some of these groups that don't seem to be as in line with maybe a freedom conservative view or a libertarian view or a fusionist view and seem to have come out of nowhere, I think are coming out of that donor frustration that for all the good work that those groups may have been doing, they weren't doing it fast enough. They weren't doing it loud enough. And I think there's a fair question for those types of groups to ask of saying, okay, how can we make sure without compromising our principles, how can we make sure that we're winning?
All right. Well, for anyone who wants to listen to this podcast faster and louder, all you have to do is turn up the volume on your phone and then go to the part where it says play at 2x speed, and we will be as fast as loud as you could possibly want. Well, that's an excellent summary, Peter. Thank you so much for being with us. And one, obviously, people should go to Giving Ventures and listen to this series on the podcast. But In addition to that, where should people seek out you and all of your professional life online?
Sure. I'm not much for the social media, although they can find me personally on LinkedIn and happy to connect there, but much more interested in people hearing these conversations of the Ventures podcast and for the donors listening, where we can be helpful to you if you believe in some of these values. We'd love to help you at Donors Trust, and that's just donorstrust.org.
All right. Thanks again, Peter.
Thank you, Richard.